there are a few things to navigate through the transition, and some of the things that need to get navigated for Australia are the retirements of the large coal-fired assets and ensuring there's enough in place of those retirements to fulfil the roles that they play. And the roles that they play are actually getting analysed more and more deeply, I'd say, by a whole range of stakeholders across the country. And for something like batteries, short-term capacity, I think many stakeholders, myself included, could see that there's signals that are reasonably strong, even in the energy-only market, to get enough capacity for customers to afford to pay for those batteries and get the investment cases away.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora, and my guest on the show is Mark Collette. Mark leads one of Australia's major vertically integrated energy gentailers, EnergyAustralia. He knows the inner workings of an energy utility as well, I think, as anyone I've had on the podcast before. Prior to his current role, he led many of the key functions at EnergyAustralia, including trading, retail, strategy, M&A, and even government relations. So welcome on the podcast, Mark.
Great to be here, John.
And we're also very fortunate to be joined by, in my mind, one of the leading thinkers in Australia on the national electricity market in Aurora, MD for Asia Pacific, Hugo Batten. Welcome, Hugo.
That's very kind. Thanks, John.
Excellent. So I'd like to start on an optimistic tone, I suppose. Mark, we the three of us caught up in Melbourne probably a few months ago over breakfast, and I think one of the things you said that struck me was I think Australian electricity policy, energy policies, got a number of things largely right. And it's just sort of slightly unusual to hear that in the Australian context, because I think there has been a lot of negativity in recent years. So, can you say a little bit about where you think the industry has got it right in Australia over the last decade or so?
Absolutely, John. And it was good to catch up with you and Hugo for breakfast. After a couple of years of lockdown, I think optimism comes even from leaving the home. That said, I do agree that Australia has got a lot of things right. If you look 20 years ago at where we were and where we are now, we've moved a long way through the energy transition. The proportion of renewable electricity has gone from 9%, which was broadly hydro, around 2005, up to about 24% now, which is a huge growth in wind and solar. And when you look at what underpinned all that, it was the way Australia designed its electricity market, an open access market and a market structure. Markets worldwide have been much more successful than regulated style regulation in just bringing the energy transition to life. And it was that open access. Anyone can connect to the transmission grid anywhere, small scale or large scale, that really underpins so much of that. Of course, there were some big policies that helped drive the initial uptake of renewables, like the renewable energy target. And some of those were done at the state level and some of those were done at the national level. And again, I'd say that Federation has actually worked in our favour here. There's many downsides to Federation in the sense that you can have squabbles around different elements of energy policy. But one of the shining lights of Federation is when a state tries something different and it works, the other states or the national government picks it up. And Australia's really benefited from that. And some of the areas, we're leading the world. We've got 3 million solar households. We've got more solar per capita than anywhere in the world. And it's easier to install solar on a rooftop here than just about anywhere in the world. So when you just stand back and look at the raw numbers, we've moved a long way, even though we never move as fast as many commentators or pundits might say we could have moved. We have moved very quickly through the energy transition.
Yeah, interesting. And I suppose that sort of touches on the recent election. We're recording this on the 23rd of May, so election a couple of days ago. And one of the first things the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said was something about ending the climate wars, or at least starting to end the climate wars. Do you have any immediate, obviously it'll all play out in the days, weeks and months to come, but do you have any immediate implications that are front of mind for you for the energy sector from the recent election?
Last year was a big year, which preceded the election. It was a big year because the coalition committed to net zero. Prior to that time, we had different parties federally, one supporting net zero, one not committed to net zero. So I actually think that was the most significant move of all, because once both sides have committed to net zero, the next question is pace. It's no longer about objective, it's more about pace. From the recent election, it looks like all signs are the pace will be faster rather than slower. The Labor government certainly took a faster paced policy to the election than the coalition had. And a lot of the independent candidates who will both have representation in the House of Representatives, but also through the minor parties in the Senate, generally, Australians have shown they're really interested in energy and they're really interested in acting on climate change faster and faster each year.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting things about the net zero mentality. The way you put it is it's no longer a question of how far, it's how fast. And I think that part of what I've seen in a number of countries that commit to net zero is until you do it, everyone thinks they're part of the other bit, the non-decarbonising bit, or they're the most important hydrocarbons in the economy. So it sort of sharpens minds to make sure everyone's thinking ahead as well. It's a good way of putting it. How fast, not how far. Hugo, can I bring you in on the election? Mark touched on the independents. Maybe worth giving a bit of context on that politically, but what are more broadly, what are your major takeaways from the election results on both the politics, which has been a key element, and the policies as they stand?
Yeah, I certainly think it's probably the most consequential election in my lifetime. And I think it is worth going back to 2019 when Labor lost, and at least in part, that loss was blamed on taking a 45% economy-wide decarbonisation target to the electorate. Organisations like the Business Council of Australia described those targets as economy wrecking. And there was certainly kind of a pretty deep post-mortem on the Labor side as to, the climate wars and how they could ever sell this to an electorate. And I think, as Mark said, we've come a long way in a relatively short amount of time. The Liberal National Party coalition did have a net zero target, although not necessarily a huge amount of detailed policy on how we were going to get there. But it certainly kind of bears out one of my theory that when public sentiment swings on issues like this, the changes are non-linear and you can move a long way in a short period of time. I think the other thing just to note on the politics of this is that both parties actually received quite a low primary vote. And it was these climate independents and Greens that actually outperformed. So it does look like the Labor Party is going to get to a majority as we sit here 2 days after the election. But I think there's certainly going to be opportunities for them to work with these climate independents on particular topics. So that's kind of a summary of the politics. I suppose on the policy, I think the key things Labor took was, one, a commitment to build out transmission faster. So what they described as a rewiring the nation. Australia is quite a long, thin grid, has had issues with issues like marginal loss factors, thermal grid curtailment. So there's 20 billion there in cheap financing to build transmission faster, which will in theory unlock more renewable capacity. And there's discussions of overhauling the current cost benefit analysis, something that the states have already pushed on, New South Wales and Victoria in particular. So I suspect we can expect to see more movement on the transmission front. On the generation front, I think it is going to be interesting. So there was discussion of around an 80% renewable generation target by 2030. Now that's broadly in line with AEMO's step change scenario, which is what the kind of wider energy industry views as most likely now. But Aurora's modelling indicates you need something like a carbon price of about $50 to get there by 2030. Now, no party in this country is suggesting an explicit carbon price on electricity, but you probably have to do something over and above BAU to hit that renewable generation target. Now, it may well be the states ramping up their CFD style support, but there is some issues there to be worked out. What we or our modelling it implies that mean for coal is that you probably do only have a few gigawatts of coal left by the early to mid 2030s versus a BAU world of about 10 gigawatts. And there was also some policy in there around, rooftop solar, community batteries, those kinds of things. So I think, Labor in some ways would deliberately not super explicit about how some of these targets would be hit, but there is going to have to be policy movement to deliver them. I think the other thing that's going to be pretty material and is perhaps underestimated is the kind of convening and coordination for a variety of reasons. I think relations between the feds, some of the states, and some of the key energy players had got challenging. So it's potentially a chance to reset there and build some more consensus around some of these policy shifts, rather than states pursuing quite balkanized energy strategies in isolation. So some big picture reflections there, but it is only 2 days afterwards, so we will have to wait and see how some of these issues play out as well.
Great, thanks, Hugo. That last one is an interesting one. It feels like maybe it's been a high watermark for state-based action right now. We will have to wait and see. I don't know, Mark, did you want to add to any of that, or I'd also like to talk to you a bit about EnergyAustralia and your strategy at the moment too.
Probably just a couple of reflections to add. One is that the Nationals retained, I believe, all of their seats. And the Nationals, for those of your listeners who are not familiar with them, they tend to have the regional seats, and they didn't have teal candidates, the independents, running on climate and other issues. And I mention that because there's still support for the national policy position, which was supportive of 2050. But the importance to Australia of that is the cities, where there has been quite a lot of change in the electorates, have gone very strongly pro-climate, according to what we can see at the moment. And in order for Australia to get to a good place, the cities have to go in concert with the regions. And the energy transition needs to be fair for everyone. So I think we've got the bones of that deal to continue now that we've got net zero on both sides. But I think that's something explicitly that all of us need to watch and make sure blends together in a way that brings the energy transition to life successfully.
Yeah. Really interesting. Great point. Okay, excellent. So EnergyAustralia's strategy within this emerging picture of Australian policy. It seems like on the generation side, you're increasingly focusing on flexibility and flexibility through a diversified portfolio. Some fast ramping gas, some hydrogen-enabled fast ramping gas, batteries, pumped hydro, of course, as well, which features prominently in particularly New South Wales energy policy. Is that a reasonable characterisation? And can you say a bit about your strategy here?
The way we think of a net zero electricity system is that there's broadly two bits. There's a lot of renewables, wind and solar, and there's firming capacity of all sorts. And lots of that today is gas-fired generation, which will be there through the transition, and lots of it in the future is different types of storage. Still got to work out exactly what the deep storage is in the system. That's an open question. We might touch on that later. But there's broadly those two bits: renewables for the times that they're there, and the flexible capacity for all the other periods. And for both, there's big and small. There's household solar and there's utility solar, and there's household batteries and utility batteries. So on that big, small, flexible capacity and renewable grid, the places we play are defined by what we are. We're a retailer. We supply customers with power whenever they need it. And off the back of that, our role is to play in the flexible capacity side of things. And that means flexible capacity in the large scale with those pumped hydro, gas, hydrogen projects. We've got a small start in hydrogen. We're hoping to grow quite significantly. Batteries, of course. And also in the home and in businesses with small scale batteries and small scale energy devices as well. And that really comes from the perspective of our job as a retailer is to give the best possible combination of big and small flexible capacity renewables to customers to help them meet their energy needs. Renewables are a type of energy that we can buy either through spot markets or through forward markets, whereas flexible capacity is a type of energy which gives us a lot of flexible, as the name implies, to store that energy and match it to customers' use. So that's why we do what we do. We're a retailer, and we've lined up flexible capacity as the part of the portfolio that gives the best outcomes for customers.
Interesting. And you said we're a retailer as sort of the basis of the strategy there, which is interesting. And it hasn't always been, you look around the world and I think, the pendulum swings back and forth on the retail markets, and there've been price caps. I know there's been some in Australia and various things like that. Some have said, we're an energy generator. Some vertically integrated utilities have said, hey, we're an energy generator. We'll do some of the downstream on the business side, but we really want to get out of households. So it's anyway, it's an interesting way to frame it. I suppose it begs another question around that rooftop solar business. What is it that, it's different to the historical approach of large-scale generations, transmission grid connections, or all of those types of things. What are the aspects of your business that enable EnergyAustralia to compete and win in that rooftop solar game, that behind-the-meter type game, do you think?
Our role is really to make sure customers get the best of large and small. And when you look at the cost structure of rooftop solar, you can install rooftop solar for the equivalent of 6 or 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And generally, if you're buying energy from the grid, electricity from the grid, it's something like 20 to 25 cents, depending on where you are. So that if you're using the energy, that clearly is economic today. Now, for many customers, they'll fund that themselves, and they'll get a great return from doing that. The area for those customers that we'll work with will be more around batteries and around other forms of energy technology, which they may see and just find hard to evaluate. What I mean by that is that something like rooftop solar is kind of easy. You can work out at 6 to 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and you can compare that to what you pay. Something like a battery, it's a lot more complicated. You're looking at a battery and saying, okay, well, I can store energy. Let me see how I work out how I can even quantify how much it costs me to store. But more than that, a lot of the value of a battery is not directly accessible to customers because it comes from wholesale markets. It comes from things like stabilizing the grid. It comes from things like changing network tariffs. And network tariffs is something that most customers don't have any direct access to. But something like a time of use network tariff will make a battery look a lot more economic very quickly than it not being there. And that's where customers get a benefit from us looking at all those different network tariff types and looking at the other sources of value that come from the wholesale market and giving and sharing that value with the customer in a way that they couldn't get it themselves. That's why they do it with us.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So Hugo, can you say a bit about so we talked a lot about the flexibility and the business case for behind the meter batteries. Can you more broadly speak about the role you see for flexible assets in Australia over the coming decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing, 3 major technology classes, at least in the Australian market, is, batteries, pumped hydro, and fast ramping gas assets. And batteries has certainly been where the bulk of the action has been. So Aurora's done something like 60 or 70 battery modelling investment cases in the last 12 months. We think Australia's going to get to about 3 to 3.5 gigawatts by the mid-2020s. Now, there are a lot of supply chain issues that currently need to be worked out, but that's what's kind of been announced and committed to. So I think kind of outside of California, where you're seeing 2 gigawatts in a year last year, it's probably one of, if not the hottest battery market in the world. I suppose we're seeing kind of 3 waves of battery investment cases, and EnergyAustralia's, got battery plans that fit into this. We've seen a wave of shorter duration, the stuff that does what's called FCAS markets, the ancillary markets in Australia. Those batteries have done extraordinarily well because FCAS prices were very high, but they're already starting to come down. The next wave is clearly longer duration batteries, and that kind of 4-ish hour duration that are doing meaningful energy arbitrage around this quite extreme duck curve. Mark quite rightly talked about the role of rooftop solar, and South Australia, I think, is the first gigawatt scale market that's starting to see negative operational demand in the middle of the day. There is a pretty deep duck curve in Australia at the moment because of rooftop and grid scale solar. So that's the second wave, the longer duration batteries. And then I think the next generation is going to be more around providing virtual transmission and alleviating some of these grid constraints I was talking about with Labor and its rewiring the nation policy. And I think we will see kind of gigawatts of batteries built out under that model. So a lot of activity in that space, and we are pretty bullish on battery investment cases, even with ancillary markets declining. Australia is this very volatile 5-minute settling market. And if you look at Queensland, for example, in the last month, spreads were 1.2 grand. That's the max price minus the min price each day for half hour. And they were $600 for a 2-hour battery. So every time you cycle your battery for a 2-hour battery, you're making $600. You know, you don't need to do that forever for it to generate a pretty decent IRR. Now, Australia's being hit by very high energy prices, high gas prices, high coal prices. Some coal plants are out. But there's a lot of volatility in the market. And as I said, we're also quite bullish on the transmission model. We're a little less bullish on pumped hydro. You know, there are more challenges. It's long lead times. It's expensive. There are environmental concerns. And we think even at 8 hours, it's starting to get outcompeted by lithium ion. But again, there's lots of ways to make it work, particularly when you've got a diversified portfolio like the gentailers and a retail base. And then in terms of gas assets, it's a little bit more asset specific, and there has been, you know, over the last year or two, a reasonable amount of government support to ensure reliability. So it's less of a pure kind of modelling exercise than some of the other investment cases. But I think batteries really, in terms of new investment, are the kind of key story in Australia at the moment, at least in my mind.
Just a quick interruption before you listen to the rest of the episode. If you enjoy our conversations with key energy leaders and decision makers from around the world, and you'd like to meet them in person, then join the Aurora Spring Forum 2022 on Thursday the 14th of July in Oxford, UK. The topic is delivering the energy transition in a fractured world, navigating price volatility, geopolitical risk and supply chain disruption. The speaker lineup includes the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, the UK Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Ben van Beurden, the Chief Executive Officer of Shell, Nora Mead Brownell, former Commissioner of FERC and former Chair of PG&E, Miguel Stilwell D'Andrade, CEO EDP and EDP Renewables, and many more. Spaces are limited and they're filling up quickly, so book your ticket now. For more details, check auroraer.com/events/spring-forum. Back now to Aurora's John Feddersen talking to Mark Collette and Hugo Batten.
For listeners, if you'd like to go into more detail on the pumped hydro storage business case in Australia, we had Malcolm Turnbull on a month or two ago talking about some of his experiences, but also the economics of how that might play out. Hugo, that's a useful segue to the topic of market design in Australia, because all of these use cases, whether it's the short-term FCAS or the longer-term transmission, particularly the longer-term transmission substitution type use cases for storage, require a detailed market framework. And I suppose the main context for this is that an organisation called the Energy Security Board was put in charge of a long-term review of Australia's power market design. And that work is still ongoing. It's been going on for a while, it feels like to me. And I suppose just to segue, for overseas listeners, Australia is, at least in theory, a wholesale-only market that settles at 5-minute granularity, but has quite a liquid contract market for long-term hedges, those types of things. Anyway, coming out of the ESB's work, the Energy Security Board's work, there were two major recommendations. The first around capacity payments to keep the lights on, I suppose, at summer peak. And the second around the introduction of a congestion management model, which in a sense is a move towards locational marginal pricing. Mark, it would be good to start with you. What are your takes on these two pillars of the policy? You know, both the market impact and I suppose if you care to speculate on the likelihood of them being introduced broadly as they currently are proposed.
On the capacity side of things, I think the basic idea has been floating around for a very long time. The idea is you've got zero marginal cost renewable generation, which will get very low spot prices. So in order to ensure that there's sufficient capacity at any point in time, introduce some sort of capacity market or mechanism to ensure that there's the right mix of flexible capacity to support the renewables. There's been a lot of debate about whether that's required in Australia. We do have an energy-only market. It has a very high market price cap. It's up around $14,000 per megawatt hour, and the price signals to ensure the capacity is available are very strong. That said, there are a few things to navigate through the transition, and some of the things that need to get navigated for Australia are the retirements of the large coal-fired assets and ensuring there's enough in place of those retirements to fulfill the roles that they play. And the roles that they play are actually getting analysed more and more deeply, I'd say, by a whole range of stakeholders across the country. And for something like batteries, short-term capacity, I think many stakeholders, myself included, could see that there's signals that are reasonably strong, even in the energy-only market, to get enough capacity for customers to afford to pay for those batteries and get the investment cases away. The issues to address at a more systemic level seem to come more in considering coal-fired retirements and the long duration storage that might be required to replace the role of those coal-fired assets. If you think about a coal-fired power station, and I'm ignoring the carbon intensity in talking about this and just saying it's an energy store. So that energy store typically has a coal stockpile of 6 weeks to 3 months sitting out the front door, which means that irrespective of weather conditions, you've got a lot in the tank to get you through all sorts of operating conditions. It's just not the case with a 4-hour battery. And as we think about all the things that can happen in an energy market, if you go back over the past year and look at Europe and look at Russia and look at wind and look at this and look at that, you can come up with any number of energy shocks that happen over the course of the year. And I think, and throw in one of your former guests who talk about the Texas grid and the 4-day outage there. And I think if you're a politician, a regulator, someone within the industry, generally you think, well, I'd quite like to have a week or two's storage of something in a fully renewable world, if I don't have gas, in order to make sure that my system has enough oomph to meet every possible set of risk conditions. And I think that's the sort of problem the capacity market is going to evolve to solve. That said, it's not immediately obvious what the technology is that has that sort of storage just sitting there, and how you would finance it, how you would fund it. Presumably the mechanism of that will be the capacity market. There's a few details to work through there. There's also a question of transition. So as coal comes out, the main thing we want out with coal is the emissions. We don't want the reliability to go when the coal goes. So something like a capacity mechanism, originally it was starting to think about, well, is there a role for gas in the capacity mechanism? That may or may not turn out that way. That's a way to get the reliability and the duration of the storage with existing technologies. But that fundamental problem of how do we ensure there's enough backup in the system to work in all shocks of every shape and size, I think that's a real problem. And I think over time we will put something in Australia that addresses that. How will it interact with the energy market? That's a question we've got to work through very carefully, because our energy market has some very good price signals which ensure that good things happen day to day in the face of high prices. The good thing about high prices is that there's a solution as well as the problem. High prices don't last forever because people do things in response. So keeping the right signals while ensuring that we have also a backup to deal with energy shocks that will occur. That's where we're going to get to, I think, with that capacity mechanism. And I'm confident we'll get there. It may take a few goes because this is the first of a kind. There's no one who I'd point to internationally who's got this particular problem solved, particularly if you don't have access to thermal fuels. We'll get there.
Yeah. Yeah, great. That really interesting market, and that whole the answer to high prices is high prices in a sense. The one thing that slightly worries me is, and we've seen this in Europe, is a number of politicians, they like markets until the markets give the wrong answer, and we've seen that in the last few months in Europe, where in some ways you would say, look, we've been rationing fossil fuel consumption because the market is telling you to ration it. In a sense, if you were trying to ration it without that price signal, you'd be consuming, I think, a lot more gas in Europe than could be supplied. So it's an interesting one. I mean, the other, that sort of, I think we're seeing that around the world, the sort of shift from, okay, where there are capacity markets, when they first introduced, okay, a 1 or 2 or 4 hour solution to, loss of load or something is probably the first thing you introduce. But as you get more and more of a particular type of peak capacity, suddenly the duration of lost load events extends, and you push your problem elsewhere in the system. So we're going to, even for people who think they've cracked it at the moment, I think that, it's one of those sort of squeeze a balloon type things where the nature of introducing a capacity market means you need to parameterize, what is a loss, what is a scarcity event, or what is a system stress event? Is it 2 hours? Is it 4 hours? Is it 8 hours? And the act of parameterizing these things as a policymaker means you push the issue somewhere else.
John, if I could just follow up, Mark,
Yeah.
I think it was a great answer on capacity markets. What about sharper locational signals? Like, I actually think the NEM, with its marginal loss factors and thermal grid curtailment, has some pretty sharp price signals that a lot of investors have got on the wrong side of. Is that your take, or do you think we need to bulk up those locational signals if we are going to deliver the gigawatts of renewables to replace coal, as well as meet additional demand from electrification?
Very similar to the conversations you've referenced. Most of the conversations I've had, developers and operators in Australia do start often from the perspective of the locational signals are reasonably strong in marginal loss factors and some of the other mechanisms that you mentioned. As we look forward, though, I think there is this one, I'm less confident that we need it as much as the capacity price signal. That said, we've done the easy bit in Australia on the renewables. And the reason I say that is that we had an existing transmission grid. The easiest part of this whole transition is to connect things to that grid until the point that it's full, and we start reaching congestion, and fossil and renewable both being constrained off at times of high output. As we get to the next phase is different. The next phase, we do need to add more transmission to connect to more renewables. And as we do that, there is a question of who pays and how we're best to do it. And I think that is absolutely worthy to explore, as the Australian Energy Market Commission is doing. And I think there is a case to consider how best to apply this to concepts like renewable energy zones and augmentations to the existing network. But as you say, the signals that we have to start with are quite meaningful. And on that basis, if it goes a little bit slower to get more consensus across the industry, to get more effective implementation, I'd say that would be probably a good thing.
Yeah, I do. And again, I'm coming from outside the country, so I may be offending various people in saying this, but I, my sense is that sort of there's this wishful thinking around, virtual transmission, as if a network company can just work out where to put batteries and put it in the regulated asset base, or some bureaucrat can decide where all the batteries will go and we'll have this perfect system. And I've never seen it work. I mean, I think you go back to nationalized monopolies, and they couldn't even work out how many gigawatts to build to satisfy peak demand. They sort of overbuilt by about 25%. So the concept that you could manage congestion in a grid by some sort of central planner and a regulated asset base feels fairly. I'd want some evidence of it, and that's not to say that that's not to say that a plan around building out the transmission network is not an incredibly useful thing, but the idea that you can place distributed resources, by decree rather than by price signals feels pretty speculative to me.
Look, probably the other element to throw in is back where we started. What's Australia done well? We've had an open access system that's been pretty simple to connect to. the more complicated the system is, the harder it is to understand, the harder it is to invest in. We lose some of the benefits that we've already got. So locational signals make a lot of sense as an economic system. That's just got to be balanced up with the simplicity and the impact on investment markets.
Yeah. Great. Hugo, can I just ask you, where are you? I mean, you asked the question, but any other thoughts on these sort of debates around capacity and the locational pricing from the ESB?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark's given some great answers there. I mean, the ESB has had an extremely hard job, and I think the Aussie system is much more like the US, where energy and electricity is actually a state-based issue, and it is much more harder to build consensus. In the UK, you get the minister, Ofgem and Bays lined up and you can do anything. Australia's just not like that. So the ESB has had a tough job. I don't think in 10 years we're going to have a radically different market where there's a UK-style capacity market, locational marginal pricing, and then some sort of carbon price signal. To me, that seems too difficult. I think there's going to be more kind of incremental evolution, states driving both capacity payments and emission reduction through CFD style contracts. Now that will have impacts, as Mark said, on the wholesale market. I think we'll have more balancing ancillary markets and location-based system strength solutions. And I think we're going to wind up having a lower bar on transmission that sees transmission get built faster. I suspect in doing all of that in a slightly disjointed way, the system will sacrifice some efficiency, but it'll give government the guardrails they want as we go through this once-in-a-generation turnover of capital stock. And it'll give them, I think, more certainty around decarbonisation trajectories. So that's kind of my take, an incremental evolution with some of those things being added into the system, rather than a kind of EMR style, big bang reform package. I could be wrong on that though, but that's my sense at the moment.
Sort of dovetails with Mark's point around a coal power station is both capacity and carbon. And, there's a couple of kind of, assuming one believes in capacity markets, there's kind of two externalities. And ideally you want the capacity, but not the emissions. And I'm probably too much of an economic purist. I think you should enable coal to compete in capacity markets as long as they're paying the right carbon price for what they're emitting. But it sounds, Hugo, like you see more of a sort of fudged, sort of muddled through here, negotiated coal closures or and planning and those types of things rather than market-oriented approach to this. So I want to talk about gentailers in the Aussie market, and probably the big. And for those listening, gentailers is sort of the Australian vocabulary for a vertically integrated utility that's on the retail side and the generation side as well. The big news at the moment from a corporate perspective is around AGL, which is I think the oldest utility in Australia and one of the largest. They are going, I think, down a different, it's not that we are a retailer model. It is that we're going to split the business into two components, a sort of fossil fuel part of the business and then a retail and renewables part of the business. And then one of Australia's richest people, Mike Cannon-Brookes, has opposed this. So, Mark, I mean, obviously, this is someone in your area of the power sector. I'm not going to ask you to comment on the AGL situation, but more generally, as we see more government intervention to deliver the decarbonisation that voters want, and as we see more zero carbon, zero marginal cost supply on the system, do you think the logic of vertical integration still holds?
Just going back a step, one of the interesting things around the AGL situation, and originally Mike Cannon-Brookes made a bid with Brookfield to purchase AGL. And the Brookfield bid was based on Brookfield having raised what they called a transition fund. And that's worthy of spending just a few moments on. The whole concept of that fund is that they've raised a multi-billion-dollar pool of capital, which is all about accelerating the closure of coal and replacing it with renewables and flexible capacity and bringing on the net zero system. That source of funding just wasn't there a couple of years ago. And since Brookfield's raised its fund, there's been a number of other financial institutions who've done something similar. And the idea that it's going to be just governments who drive the decarbonisation, I think that's being challenged by the existence of these funds and also by the actions of customers, particularly corporate customers who've committed to their own net zero plans and are now seeking through offtake and other actions to take their electricity use and the emissions associated with that electricity use down. So I think it's governments, it's customers, and it's funding now, all of which are pointing to a faster transition. What does that mean for a company like mine in terms of having both generation and retail? It means that we've got to start with what the customers want, and if the customers, both large and small, are seeking decarbonise electricity, not just electricity, which they've done at times in the past, it doesn't mean that's our job. That's what we need to do. And I said earlier, as a retailer, our job is to bring the best of large-scale renewables, large-scale flex capacity, and small-scale behind-the-meter flex capacity and behind-the-meter renewables, and that really is the job. And I don't think you can do it just by being a retailer and not being across at least access to the technology. It might be some do it through partnerships rather than directly, but knowing how to get the best out of small-scale batteries, EV chargers, coordinating all these technologies in a way that customers get the best answer. The only way to do that is to have the knowledge to actually do it.
And just to add on that, Brookfield, but I mean, the other positive aspect for me, Mark, I mean, it relates to what you said, is this sort of evolution of ESG. I think the whole ESG investing movement has given some really weird answers over the last few years. It's sort of, Shell, it's like 80% of their decarbonisation over the last few years has been divestments rather than sort of investments in decarbonisation, and the assets still exist, right? I think someone said recently Tesla had been cut from S&P's ESG listings and Exxon was still on it or something like that. Without knowing the details, there are some things that just don't quite pass the pub test on some of this stuff. So to me, net zero is a transition, right? It's not zero tomorrow. Zero tomorrow would be a disaster. And so for someone like Brookfield and Mark Carney's been involved there to say, look, this is a transition, and we're burning coal tomorrow. It's what we're doing, but we're transitioning. I think shows maturity, bravery in a positive sense of the word. But it feels like the whole movement is evolving in a positive direction in terms of the trajectory to net zero as well. I'd like to finish, Mark, by talking a little bit about your career. I said at the start, you'd been at EnergyAustralia for 20 years. You've basically done all the big jobs at EnergyAustralia before taking on the biggest job. What's kept you there over that period of time? It's a decent stint.
Yes, I'm coming up to 20 years, and I've been here because I'm an energy geek and I love the energy industry. I joined the energy industry because I thought we did something that was really useful, and our job is really to make the lives of people and to make the economy work, and we do that every day. But equally, I joined for the energy transition, and it looked like it was going quite slowly there for quite a while, and it is just going as quickly as you can imagine now. And I think in some senses, the risk now is that we go too fast and have a few unexpected shocks along the way rather than go too slow. And that's pretty exciting because I get to work on all of those ways to get better outcomes for customers and avoid those shocks. And I find it fascinating. I find it really useful. And it's something that's really great to talk to my kids and say, this is what I did today. And they're like, oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, totally agree. And if you were starting your career now, let's say you're 22, you've just graduated from university, what would you be? You've decided you're entering the energy sector. What would you be doing right now, Mark? Do you think, apart from joining EnergyAustralia? I mean, it goes without saying, obviously.
Yes, well, if it wasn't join EnergyAustralia in any capacity, I looked at the energy industry so broad now, right? And it used to be much smaller. But now energy is topical with all sorts of customers and in a very broad amount of ways. So I could recommend people join renewables developers, join traders, join market analyst houses, join Woolworths or retailers and work on their net zero transition plans because it all leads back to energy. And getting at least 3 different perspectives on the problem, I think is a good way to go about coming up with an understanding that then lets you go and focus on things that will really make a difference and solve multiple problems in the energy industry. Because one thing I will say is that if your solution, whether it's a policy or an offering to a customer, only solves part of their problem, it never quite gets there. There's a bit of complexity to work through here. And if you put forward something that solves multiple problems, they just tend to work better.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Hugo, can I ask you just quick, just to round it up, you're starting your career again in the energy sector. Where would you go?
Yeah, I don't know. Clearly my career is much less distinguished than Mark, so maybe I wouldn't have as many options. But look, I think it's, as Mark said, often it's on the consumption side that some of the, Google's analysis around 24/7, like how awesome to join a team like that. Audrey Zieberman, the former head of AEMO, is leading a team at Google X on mapping the grid. So the big tech guys are getting involved in energy in a way they never were before, just as an example. So maybe an angle like that I think would be fascinating. I'd probably say Aurora though, John, obviously.
I was setting you up. I do. I'm going to sound slightly biased here, but I do think something to do with either power modeling or power trading is a very useful set of skills to build up in the first couple of years of your career. I say that with a very straight face. I think it's such a physical market, and just like understanding the details of how it works is a basis for doing a lot of very useful stuff. And I think if you haven't done that, it can be a bit of a handicap as you try and do all these other hugely interesting things. It's a bit like learning to read when you're 5 years old. It's kind of fundamental, I think. But as I say, I'm sure I'm biased.
I think that's right. And trading and analysis are both great places to start. I just think you've got to combine them with the problems faced by a customer or the problems faced by a government. And if you do both, you're just in a much better position to then make a difference.
Yeah. I think it's fairly common that a trader or a modeler gets accused of slightly oversimplifying the world in a sense. Common criticism. Sort of we've got a line in our spreadsheet that's CapEx or something like that, and anyone who's been through the permitting process and worked with contractors on site knows that it's a little bit more than a line in an Excel spreadsheet. Excellent. Okay. So one final question, Mark. I'm not going to go through overrated and underrated, which I normally do at Hugo's behest. But who do you read or listen to in the energy space that you think is always good, thought-provoking, relevant for your work?
Lots of good sources. I do like Energy Unplugged, so I'll give you guys a plug right back. I always enjoy listening to the other guests that you've had. I do like listening to Cleaning Up with Michael Liebrecht. He's got some really, really interesting views and has got access to, again, some wonderful people. And then there's other people who'll publish reports. The Grattan Institute in Australia typically do some very good work and always have some thought-provoking stuff. And then of late, I've read a few books and longer form materials. The Bill Gates How to Avoid a Climate Disaster I quite like, because it was a very readable way to go beyond electricity, where I spend my time, into other sectors as well. Alan Finkel's quarterly essay of a few years ago, to get to net zero, was again of that ilk, the whole system and how you solve it. And then more recently, some of the work that Saul Griffith has done with the Big Switch book in Australia and Rewiring America. I do think there is a tendency to focus on the big stuff rather than the small stuff. And there's a lot of runway on the small stuff. So a bit more examination on that side with the likes of Saul Griffith's work has been really interesting of late.
Right. Excellent. Well, that's a good note to finish on. So finally, it falls to me to thank both my guests. So first, Hugo, thanks for jumping on the other side of the microphone today and being a guest and sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks, John.
And finally, Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to share your deep expertise on the state of the energy transition in Australia.
Thanks, John. Pleasure to be here.
That was John Feddersen, founder and CEO of Aurora, talking to Mark Collette, Managing Director of EnergyAustralia, and Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director in Australia and California. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.